So I'm just going to take us through just a few slides to look at some of the conclusions from the psychosocial survey and what young people were actually telling us. So as both Catherine and Sam have indicated, there were clear objectives for each of our surveys. And here in the UK, we were looking at particular stages within adolescence too. And looking at the research, we then gave them the labels of early adolescence, which we devised as between 10 and 14, and looked at also middle adolescence between 15 and 18 to see if we could see whether there were any differences in the types of abuse at particular ages or the severity of abuse within different ages. And obviously that included ethnicity too, and we also looked at whether things, particular types of maltreatment were higher in boys or higher in girls. Our sample size, as I sort of indicated for those of you who were with us yesterday, is the smallest of all the countries, and I'll go into some of the reasons for that again briefly. But it was 1,499 females, 1,313 males, with a mean average of about 14 and a half years. And the data came from 4 primary schools. That was just their final year. So what we call here in the UK year 6. So that'd be 10-year-olds, 5 secondary schools, high schools, and 3 colleges for 16 to 18-year-olds. The challenges of conducting the survey. Schools and colleges here in the UK, like many globally, are very used to enabling their students to carry out surveys, to fill in surveys, should I say, not carry out. And they're usually around health and well-being. So this was the first time that educators were shown something that was the focus was quite new and was looking very deliberately at abuse and neglect both inside and outside the family home. And they felt very concerned about their children and young people having access to such questions for a number of different reasons. There was some risk aversion, feeling that as soon as children started to fill in such questionnaires, that there could be an avalanche of disclosures, and they didn't have the resources to be able to deal with that. There was some denial too that perhaps their school wouldn't have such levels of abuse and therefore it wasn't pertinent for them to get involved in our research. There were other reasons too, which I won't go into, but it just made it very difficult for us to gain access to young people and for them to be able to let researchers know the extent of the abuse that was happening for them. Also here in the UK, there's a great deal of self-determination for schools. Many of them are called academies now. And so they are not under the influence of the local authority as they used to be. So it makes it much easier for them independently to be able to say no rather than be dictated to by perhaps a local safeguarding board or a local authority. So there was a lot of barriers and gatekeeping to the children through fear and through sometimes not wanting to know how much abuse their children were experiencing. It wasn't always negative, I have to say, and I need to shout out to a number of mainly safeguarding leads and pastoral leads in schools who were very excited about what we were doing, who were very open to young people being included, and for them to find out how much abuse was happening for their children and young people because it would help them shape curricula. But unfortunately, when we got to senior leadership teams that was when the answer quite firmly became a no. So in terms of our experience of young people completing the survey, for us, it was very resource heavy. And that was in the first instance of trying to persuade young people to persuade schools to say yes. So it involved a lot of face-to-face meetings, of presentations, etc., to finally get a yes. We did a mixture of online surveys and hard copy surveys. With the online surveys, there felt at time a lack of researcher presence because obviously schools and colleges were doing it independently. And therefore, we were unable to perhaps set the scene and to give the context, and particularly why their answers mattered. And sometimes I think that the Ni3 focus was perhaps lost in translation a little. The surveys were fairly long. They took, between 30 and 40 minutes sometimes to complete, depending on accessibility, but also dependent on students' ability to understand. And so often teachers were called in to read through some of those surveys to help that happen. The issue of gender arose, and certainly in our survey, we had male, female, and allowed in the drop down list young people to be able to self identify. I think due to our lack of being present and being able to talk through issues of gender and how important it was for self-disclosure in terms of self-identification, it just meant that some of our returns we couldn't use as being young people. A number were self-identifying as either Jedi or penguins, etc. So it just made life a little bit more difficult. But gender is an issue that I think as researchers we really need to consider how we're going to capture people's self-identification. Disclosures from students were rare, so the worry and concern from heads of schools and colleges was over exaggerated. The tsunami of disclosures didn't come. They were very rare, and no school or college experienced a rise in requests for help and support, which perhaps unfortunately shows how difficult disclosure is, and how young people often choose not to disclose within a school or college setting. And so from the experience, I think we would all say that educational establishments need to be braver to ensure young people are given a voice. They can manage difficult questions, and don't undermine young people, as significant numbers are already managing abuse in their everyday lives. So key findings. Obviously, as Sam and Catherine have alluded to, by just expanding the indicators of abuse as we have done, and not just looking at perhaps the two most prominent ones in recent research or previous research, which is around sexual abuse and physical abuse, the prevalence within our participant group has risen to almost 30% in terms of experiencing one or more forms of maltreatment. So, which a key finding would be that it's not always how you ask, but what you ask is vitally important. White British adolescents reported the most abuse within the home and reported the highest levels of depression and anxiety too, with girls twice as likely to report the all different levels of anxiety compared to boys, and girls were 3 times more likely to report symptoms of severe depression compared to boys. We need to be careful, obviously, in interpretation. That's not to say that boys do not experience high levels of anxiety or depression, but given gender stereotypes and conditioning, boys may not feel able to self-disclose or self-report that. Most prevalent forms of abuse were emotional abuse, more than a third, along with emotional neglect. And corporal punishment came in at third, and with a significant number experienced corporal punishment within the home. Outside of the family home, what was interesting is that emotional abuse was high there. So emotional abuse, both inside and outside the family home, was really significant. And girls were more than twice as likely to report that non-contact sexual abuse outside of the family home than boys. 1 in 4 young people, in terms of what the abuse does to mental health, was a significant finding, as 1 in 4 people reported suicide ideation or non-suicidal self-injury. Girls, again, twice as likely to report, with a slight increase in, as children got older, of reporting suicide ideation or suicide self-injury. Suicide attempts were highest in white British girl, but the magnitude of difference between the ethnic groups was really very small. Exposure, I mean, given the look of the UK and the research that we've done in terms of domestic violence and its implications for young people, I think what resonated here was that almost a third of all young people were reporting experiencing verbal abuse, with girls reporting more than boys, and a third of adolescents also witnessing and were victims of parental verbal violence, and 1 in 10 reporting physical domestic abuse. As we know, abuse and neglect are never experienced as isolated incidents, and adverse childhood experiences were multiple in many children's lives. So it was, so I will come to the next slide in terms of what that meant for 5 ACEs or more. But it's significant to remember, just as domestic abuse is never a series of one-off incidents, neither is abuse and neglect, and it is felt and experienced and witnessed on a very regular basis. When we looked at early and middle adolescents, younger adolescents were more likely to report emotional abuse than older adolescents, after all, along with corporal punishment, medical and emotional neglect. So those were some of the key findings. Agata Dabrowski, who was looking at policy briefs for the UK, this is one of the first ones that her and I wrote, and had a conversation with both the Home Office and the Department for Education about our findings. And this policy brief was particularly just looking at adolescent girl experiences, which I think is quite shocking, in that 1 in 3 girls had experienced emotional abuse both within and outside of the family home, and 1 in 3 verbal domestic violence, which I think goes to show how underreported domestic abuse probably is. Experiences of emotional abuse and verbal domestic abuse were the most common forms of ACEs reported by all girls across age groups and ethnic backgrounds. 1 in 2 girls of white British origin reported experience of emotional abuse within the home, and as many as 21% of white British girls experienced 5 or more adverse child experiences. 1 in 6 girls aged between 15 and 18 and girls of Black, African, Caribbean, Black British and mixed heritage have experienced non-contact sexual abuse outside the home. Unfortunately, the research that we have here in the UK means that that's not necessarily a surprising finding, but obviously the use of technology and the ability that gives to non-contact sexual abuse has to be considered. So 1 in 3 girls reported 3 or more ACEs in their lifetime, with 15 experiencing 5 or more. 40% of adolescent girls, thankfully, reported no experience of ACEs. So 2 more slides left. I'll be as quick as I can, just to say what some of our research recommendations are in terms of what we have listened to and know about the findings. For researchers, obviously, it's important. We've shown, I think, that it's important to have a comprehensive range of subtypes of maltreatment included in any future surveys so that children experiences are easily captured and we find the true extent of child maltreatment and that on mental health. We need longitudinal studies to be able to research and examine different types of abuse across childhood and adolescence, and some parental and professional perspectives would also be very helpful. Thinking about how long does it take professionals to intervene and what does that look like, and what level of severity does child abuse and maltreatment have to get to before help is resourced. There is a lack of peer-on-peer abuse and that needs further research. Schools and colleges, sometimes a breeding ground for further sexual harassment and abuse. And so they need to instigate zero tolerance strategies, looking at said harassment and abuse, and there needs to be consequences to abusive behaviour. Following on from the psychosocial survey, just anecdotally, we've been approached by 2 schools who have significant difficulties with sexual harassment, with girls very clearly saying that even when it's reported, there is no or very little consequence to abusive behaviour, and that really needs to be addressed. Sex and relationship education needs to be more authentic and less biological. And this links to a lot of our Work Package 2 recommendations around our game and around our curriculum. But teachers need to be much, much braver around exploring, discussing and challenging what is unfortunately childhood and adolescent realities of relationships, both in their intimate relationships and at home. We need earlier interventions, which are almost non-existent now in the UK, given the current government policies. And we need support for parents that are non-threatening and particularly resource-led and supportive. We need much more responsive mental health services for young people. We have young people now on waiting lists for a year, 18 months before they can actually access any mental health support. In this country, we need to address child poverty and poor housing. The pandemic has highlighted even more so the huge disparities across the UK, leaving millions of children very, very vulnerable. Over 4.3 million children now live in poverty, with 75% of those in a household where at least one adult is working. So there's a huge need for policies to change, not only in terms of people's living wage, but also in establishing better housing for children. Often children and their families are resident in hotels and hostels, which means that they are in very, very vulnerable environments. We've had pilot evaluations where social workers are in schools, which has proved very, very positive for earlier interventions. As we've learned, exposure to domestic abuse is extremely high, so we need to continue to focus on effective perpetrator interventions and professionals intervening to protect children and women. This is within the current policy briefs of the Domestic Abuse Act, but as all of you will know, having a policy is one thing, having it out in practice with professionals carrying that out is another. Schools and communities need more funding and resources to build safer, more resilient environments for children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I'm going to move on quite swiftly because I think we're running quite a lot behind time. So if I can come on to Christine next for you to present the Jamaica survey findings for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm uploading now or sharing now.
Thank you.
Carol will be starting. Carol will be starting with the here I am.
There we are.
Anytime you're ready, Harriet.
Okay, good morning. Well, good day, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you, Christine. All right, so I'm just going to do a real whistle stop tour, sharing with you or highlighting a few of the challenges that we experienced while conducting the survey. First, to begin, in Jamaica, we had quite a challenge to gain ethical approval. This took quite a while, and so, everything was stalled until ethical approval was granted. However, once ethical approval was granted, then we were able to start everything. While waiting on ethical approval, naturally, a lot of planning went into what we were going to do, especially because we had our sample size was increased from the initial figure of 2,000 to 10,000. And so we had to ensure that we had a good strategy to efficiently collect, 10,000 surveys or administer 10,000 surveys. Well, we didn't quite hit the mark of 10,000. We came close to 8,000, which for a small country of about 8 million, that was, I would say, pretty good. And so that was also a challenge. And then having and what we did in terms of our strategy for that is that we got a sample frame, because the country is divided into 6 regions. And so we got the population size of each school, we ranked it from highest population to lowest, and we targeted in the first instance all the schools, whether primary or high schools, that had the highest population. And then we went down the list depending on whether or not they accepted to be engaged in the survey. Another important challenge that we experienced was that although we had ethical approval from the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, um, as was expected, some schools had refused to participate in the study. And so, we just had to move on to some other schools. But this was not, in many instances, this was not at the first instance that they would have said to us, on the first phone call, they would have said to us no. In some instances, we were unable to get through to either the principal or the vice principal or whomsoever was responsible for granting approval per school. And so that was a little frustrating. In other schools, among those that had agreed to participate in the study, um, some of them, although we had confirmed the date and time and we would have sent to them many weeks before the parental consent forms, the assent forms, and the information sheets, and we had confirmed with them a convenient date and time. Unfortunately, in some instances, when we turned up at the schools at the agreed time and date, um, many of them were simply not prepared to accept us and to accommodate us. And I remember in one instance, in one of the regions where we were out of town, um, conducting the surveys in a particular region, we had budgeted for about 2 hours maximum, knowing that from the pilot it would have taken the students approximately 45 minutes to an hour to complete the survey. We thought that, with all the administrative matters related to that, we would have been able to be finished in 2 hours. However, I remember in one school we spent almost 9 hours that day. simply because there was, just this lack of communication internally in the school. So the person who had we were in touch with prior to going to the school, by the time we were about to conduct the survey on the day, she was on leave, and somehow there was a breakdown in communication. So that was a little frustrating. Also, there was an issue with relation to the manner in which informed consent was required. So in the beginning, parents were asked to only sign the consent form if they did not wish for their child to be a part of the study, which is not what we're accustomed to in Jamaica. And very soon after that, with pushback from the school administrators, we had to quickly change the wording to have them do what we're accustomed to doing, which is to sign giving consent for their child to be a part of the study. Also, one last important challenge, or two actually, is that some students, as you would imagine, students can be students. So some of them forgot to give their parents the consent forms to sign. And of course, the school administrators, along with ourselves, were very careful not to allow anybody to participate in the study unless the requisite approval was granted. And finally, the last point that I'll make is that because of the length of time that it took for us to gain ethical approval, we by the time we got approval, it was very late in the Christmas term, and so we didn't have a lot of time to collect the data, and there was a spillover into the Easter term between January and March. And during that term, a lot more activities take place, and their schools are less willing to accommodate us. And so that was another challenge. But happily, despite all of that, we were able to surmount the challenges for the most part, and we collected, as I said, close to 8,000 surveys. So, Christine, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carol. So in terms of key findings, what surprised us, so we did our survey, and around 61% of our participants were females, and our participants range between the ages of 9 and 17 years. We went into 20 primary and secondary schools, and 31% of the population lived in urban areas and the remaining 69% in rural areas. So maltreatment in the home, the prevalence of maltreatment, over 80% of children surveyed reported that they had experienced at least one form of maltreatment inside the home. And almost half of them experienced 3 or more types of maltreatment in the home. 70% of children reported that they were emotionally abused at least once by a parent or guardian or an adult in the home. And this was the most frequently experienced type of maltreatment in the home. And this is a concern because emotional abuse is not greatly studied. And it is possible that we may be seeing an underreporting of this because maybe, it's likely that children are seeing this as abuse. So that's a possibility. Almost 2/3 of children experience corporal punishment at least once in the home. And this is not surprising. Corporal punishment is, a way that it's really cultural. So the punishment that way is just seen as children being disciplined. 22% of children were physically abused by a parent, guardian, or other adult in the home. and 10% of children experienced non-contact sexual abuse, 5% contact sexual abuse by a parent, guardian, or other adult in the home. Other types of maltreatment in the home, 50% of children experienced emotional neglect, 20% medical, and 10% physical neglect. And there really wasn't any great meaningful gender differences for any of the types of maltreatment experienced in the home. For maltreatment outside the home, around 13% of children reported that they experienced 3 or more types of maltreatment. Under half the children reported that they have experienced emotional abuse by a non-family member. And again, this means that emotional abuse was the most frequently type of maltreatment experience. So whether in the home or outside the home, this was the most prevalent type of maltreatment. Sexual abuse, about a quarter of the children experienced non-contact sexual abuse and 10% sexual abuse by an adult outside their home. So both types of sexual abuse were actually more common outside the home than inside the home. Females were more likely to report experiencing any form of sexual abuse when compared with males. And this is outside the home. But this doesn't mean necessarily that it's a possibility that males are actually underreporting. So for our culture, there's labeling is one of those things that happen. If you were in yesterday's if you saw the listing of topics that were suggested by stakeholders, you'd have seen labeling as one of those topics that we were being encouraged to study. Because of that, boys are more likely to not report. So despite the females reporting more, type of sexual abuse, it doesn't mean that it's not as high for males. Other types of maltreatment outside the home, approximately 15% of children experience corporal punishment, and almost 10% were physically abused by an adult outside the home. Exposure to violence within the home. So 32% of children witnessed verbal violence, 22% witnessed physical violence, and 14% a serious violence threat between adults in their home. And what this could be indicating is that there may actually be a widespread of domestic abuse in Jamaican homes. Both boys and girls actually reported, witnessing violence in the home. So this was being seen equally by both boys and girls. Empathy towards child victims of maltreatment. So in comparison to boys, girls reported higher levels of both affective empathy and cognitive empathy towards child victims of maltreatment. And this is not surprising because other studies have found this kind of empathy or pro-social behaviors among girls. Psychological well-being. 24% reported moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety, and 24% reported moderate to severe symptoms of depression. And girls were more likely to report elevated symptoms of both anxiety and depression than boys. And the magnitude of the sex difference was not as pronounced as might have been expected based on previous studies. So this was one difference that we saw. Non-suicidal self-injury, suicide attempt, and especially suicide ideation were more common amongst girls and boys. However, this is not to say that boys are at a reduced risk of suicide. The reality is that the sad reality that boys are more likely to actually complete suicide, which means, which makes it more likely to have a disproportionately over representation of girls in this estimation. 28% of children reported a lifetime history of non-suicidal self-injury, 41% suicide ideation, and 20% suicide attempt. And of course, this is, a cause for concern. And given the magnitude of the problem, it is imperative that public health measures are urgently instilled to promote positive psychological well-being among children and young people. So the recommendations coming from our research. First one, the use of age-appropriate education programs focused on explaining children's rights. And we have the game Gabriel, which you'll hear more about tomorrow. And it is designed for 14 to 17-year-olds in the Caribbean. And it promotes the awareness of, what constitutes abuse and how and to whom such experiences can be reported. And it also gives awareness about, power play and grooming and, coercion and, silencing of victims. So the game created is one solution or part of a solution. Next recommendation, support parents who are at an increased risk of abusing or neglecting their children. So appropriate workshops could be held, and one place that we could see this being done is the National Parenting Support Commission from the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. And you'll see that we have their written endorsement and so on, and they actually provided us with our national response team. Cultural attitudes that normalize and reinforce the perpetration of child abuse and neglect need to be penetrated. And this suggested ways, media campaigns, so print and social media campaigns, low budget television and radio broadcast, and popular music by leading recording artists. I'm sorry, my alarm for 7 a.m. just went off. Programs for young people with a particular focus on boys are needed to increase empathy towards victims of child abuse and neglect. So again, the video game Gabi that we have developed is actually one of the aims is to challenge attitudes that normalize violence against children and to promote understanding of the impacts of child abuse and neglect on victims. So this the game should also help to increase empathy. Empower children and young people to recognize the signs of poor mental health, express how they are feeling, and seek help. One suggestion is having interactive digital technologies such as smartphone applications for this. And develop an age-specific policy that addresses the prevention of suicide and the promotion of positive psychological well-being among children and young people. So we have the policy brief developed, and of course we'll be working from there. And we have our planned government engagement as well to work hand in hand with that to, make sure that we get things. I mean, it does not end here when at the end of this project, Ni3 continues. So when I see, this beautiful girl, and, just to me reminds me of what, I know not all Jamaican children have a Rastafarian hair, but I mean, when you see this picture, you think of a Jamaican child immediately, and I'm just looking forward to children not having anything to worry about and just smiling and happy, and all they have to think about is go to school and do well and think of the future. Despite members of Ni3 coming from all kinds of background, we are actually all together for the same goal. And we may look different, and the specific gender-based violence monster that we are fighting may be different, but there are still similarities, and we have to go after these things in the way we can. So at some point, we're going to have this momentum. And you see, when that momentum builds, it won't stop, right? So that is something that I know. And when I see something like the Me Too movement that can just gain momentum, all these persons that have the power to do all kinds of things in the same way, I expect that all of the various types of gender-based violence that we are fighting in our respective countries, we are going to overcome. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carol and Christine. That was an amazing overview of what's happened in Jamaica. I'm increasingly aware that we are incredibly behind on our schedule, and I recognise that some of our international experts are going to have to leave shortly. I do apologise, but the detail that we're going into with these surveys, I feel, is actually important. And so I don't really want to cut things short. So apologies for everybody that we are running a little bit late. Can I now move on to Eric, please? And if you can, could you go quite fast for us, Eric? Thank you. Actually, we may have lost Eric, in which case, could I come to you, Banu and Prarthana, for your survey findings and challenges? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Prarthana Patil, and on behalf of the entire India team, I'm going to present to you the findings and learnings from the quantitative research study conducted in India. It's also interesting to note that, when Christine was sharing her presentation and when I saw the picture of that little girl, I think I remembered the last discussion we had before we broke for the pandemic with Bhanu and Adele, actually visiting all the countries just before we could end the project. And unfortunately, we are here in a lockdown, but I hope that in the future I can come and visit each of you, because it would be interesting to put faces to all this work that we have done. The objectives for quantitative research were quite straightforward: to understand the prevalence of maltreatment in the form of punishment and abuse, violence within the home, mental health status that included depression, suicide, and self-harm related behaviors amongst boys and girls in India. We collected data from 8,365 children recruited from 20 secondary schools in the city and suburbs. Before going into the details, a very brief glimpse into the processes undertaken by the India team to make the service accessible to students of Mumbai, especially belonging to schools where English language comprehension is relatively weak. First, we carried out a pilot run of the English language questionnaire with students of a government-aided school. This gave us a completely different picture. Even students from English medium schools were unable to understand many of the conversationally unfamiliar jargon used in the survey. In total, 105 students participated in the pilot study. Objective was to understand whether students of class 5 to 9 are able to clearly understand the questionnaire and respond in the most effective ways. Learning outcomes from the pilot suggested that some words and phrases are uncommon to Indian culture, which requires translations and simplifications. Children from 5th standard, that is ages 10 to 12, could not understand some of the words. Choke, sexual, adult, awkward, partner. Many students misunderstood this term as a colleague. The shift from a 3-point scale to a 5-point scale was especially confusing, since many of them couldn't differentiate between strongly and sometimes, and were asking the teachers to explain the difference. They were mostly confused about questions on gender bias. Many were bored of filling up the survey, which to them was rather long, as indicated in the feedback. Though most of them answered, they understood everything in the survey. In the answers, we can see that there are gaps. While the boys seemed more proactive while taking the survey, it was the girls whose answers seemed to make slightly more sense. The teachers assisting with the surveys were worried about how the students will understand the concepts, since the primary level of education in this country. At the same time, they were also eager to help, with the survey having handled situations of violence against young people. This exercise not only helped in simplifying survey, but it gave us the opportunity to translate the surveys into Hindi, Marathi, and into Urdu, mindfully to reach a more diverse population. With the help of the WP4 leaders, we finalized the survey questionnaires, which were now more tailored to the needs and understanding of Indian young people. With the help of the Alternative Story, an organization we had collaborated with, we conducted a workshop to deal with situations if any child came forward with cases of child abuse or neglect. In a 2-day workshop, field researchers were given a run-through the relevant laws. The debriefing form carried the number of a member from the Alternative Story, whom the student could call in case they were triggered by participating in the survey. This gave us a complicated picture. It was found that maltreatment within and outside the home was very high, in line with several other studies conducted before. Violence within home was also very high, meaning young people who participated in the study witnessed regular violence at home. Similarly, both boys and girls were adversely impacted by the violence they were witnessing or facing, leading to considerable problems with their mental health. Empathy was present in both boys and girls, but girls were slightly more empathetic, both cognitive and affective, than boys. When questioned about gender roles, we saw both girls and boys equally endorsing traditional gender roles. These numbers are only a glimpse into the results of our survey, and our final survey report gives a more nuanced perspective to the numbers we see here. The set of recommendations suggested by India should not be seen in silo. They can only be effective when we use our data to address the structural challenges and inequalities within systems. Students belonging to more marginalized and vulnerable backgrounds must receive the required help in terms of personal development, like having a list of students who come from difficult circumstances or have faced discrimination before. The school authority should be aware of all kinds of abuse, neglect, discrimination students are or may be facing in their lives outside of school. Focused research on child maltreatment should be encouraged by trustee boards and ministry in collaboration with child rights organizations. This should lead to designing on specific programs for students, parents, and faculty, alongside research in areas of how lack of specific infrastructure like toilets, classrooms, etc. impedes holistic education of students needs to be implemented. Including professionals working on child neglect and abuse issues as part of school administration, even on a temporary basis, to sensitize staff and faculty, raising awareness on maltreatment as a recurring phenomenon, not just limited to sexual abuse. Curriculum may include information about psychological well-being practices and know-how from an early age. Interventions that normalize non-hegemonic, non-traditional masculinities and femininities are key to giving the support a child needs in combating traditional beliefs in gender roles. Along with ensuring a student's good physical health, like midday meals programs, focus should also be given to their mental health, since there are many students living in violent environments. The National Commission for Protection of Child Rights in 2012 came out with guidelines post conducting a study on prevalence of corporal punishments in the schools. The guidelines call for multi-sectoral approaches to dealing with the issues and listed down guidelines for each stakeholder, depending on the severity of truancy of the students. The same is to be monitored by corporal punishment monitoring cells, which we recommend be implemented and set up. Streamlining the process and protocol of reporting child abuse so that the survivor in question must bear with least problems. Judicial system should also be able to recognize the nuances and forms of child abuse and neglect prevalent and give judgments that are sensitive to the child's needs. Young boys are at risk of facing violence and maltreatment just as much as girls. Opening conversations around sexual, physical, and emotional health, not in a gender segregated manner in the classroom, along with a regular myth busting of prevalent notions of gender and sexuality, can enable more reporting for both boys and girls. Child abuse and neglect is pervasive and is a matter of grave concern, and correct course of action should be undertaken by school authorities, even if the space of occurrence is in the home. Knowing the background of student is important. Giving help to faculty to gather this knowledge is important. This means talking to parents who have committed discrimination, abuse, neglect, and sensitizing them around child rights issues. As part of our global strategy, we had a memorandum of understanding with the Maharashtra state government, which helped us with approaching most of the schools. The first school we approached was keen on having all their students surveyed, but with the use of passive consent forms, we conducted surveys of only those students whose parents passively gave us consent. Majority of the schools that showed disinterest in conducting the survey raised concerns about the sensitive nature of the survey. Disseminating knowledge around emotional and sexual well-being of adolescent was a topic not easily accepted by school management. We learned and modified our liaising strategies with management of the schools. Our senior research assistant Anne and other field supervisor, being a Christian, helped us recruit some private schools that were run by Catholic missions. We tried our best to include geographically diverse survey population. There were definite language barriers because a vast majority of those who took the survey were first generation learners, and especially with English not being the first language for most of the students that they speak at home. Even with the translations, it was a task to avoid doing literal translations. Biases are especially hard to control when humans are involved. In our training, we stressed on the importance of an unimpassioned explanation of the difficult words or any sentences that needed to be explained to students who did not follow the survey. But sometimes biases come out in the tonality of our voices. We saw this when some teachers had to step in with special students in their classes. Yet, carrying out the surveys in the various schools of our field workers was a humanizing experience. Some schools had about 90 students in one classroom, and even two field workers. We faced a considerable amount of hardships trying to get the students to calmly fill their surveys. The surveys were 11 pages long. The students would get fatigued doing the survey. We noticed stark inequity between the different schools we approached, especially according to their geographical locations. Our first school was in the middle of a slum area. The first day we went to conduct the survey, there was no electricity. The survey was called off since the students were sent home. The school lacked ventilation. Sizable population of students from low-income communities because of the requirements of 25% seats being reserved for them under the Right to Education Act 2009. We did not want to be researchers who were only here to collect data from the students. So keeping in mind that some interactions were absolutely necessary to put participants in a zone that made it easy for them to understand the survey to their best ability. Maltreatment is a sensitive topic, and we enabled our researchers and volunteers with all the knowledge they required to destabilize the inherent researchers' subject hierarchy and provide sensitivity. Researchers could determine case-specific actions or responses, but also keep in mind ethical guidelines like not leading the data or maintaining confidentiality. In our experience, we found that students were eager to share their experiences verbally. Even school counselors and principals reached out to ask for suggestions in dealing with difficult situations like lack of funding. Listening to the stories helped us get a clear understanding of inequalities and inherent violence embedded in the education system in India. Our researchers, volunteers were given a background of Indian laws pertaining to child abuse and neglect to give the idea that working with young people means rethinking our own positions. We wanted to be able to provide care when necessary. The anonymity of the survey itself was impactful. As we learned from one principal of a school, aggressive children were calmer, a considerable reduction in self-harm in students who displayed such behavior regularly. When strategizing large-scale data collection of sensitive issues where participants are adolescents, it is very necessary to also be able to emotionally engage with the research area as well as the participants themselves. To create a sense of responsibility to the participants who would have to deal with triggering questions, and knowing our own abilities and limitations can envision a future that values the lived realities of marginalized young people, not just as subjects of research, rather as human beings who can bring social change. Thank you very much. And I think I would like to thank the entire team for supporting us through this very complex process of conducting the psychosocial surveys in India.
Thank you, Prarthana. That was a really informative presentation, and just hearing of the complexity of conducting this type of study, but of the value of it to some of the young people themselves that we heard from the principal of the school the other day. I'm wondering, is Eric with us again now so that we can come on to Eric? I'm not sure whether, I think Eric has, unfortunately, I can see he pops in now. Oh, Eric, you are there.
Yes.
Oh, hi.
Yes.
Can we hear from the Uganda survey? Thank you, Prarthana and Manu.
Network was a little bit on and off, but I'm here now. Yes. So, Nick, do you want to help me again, or you guide me how to share? I'm not sure I know how to upload my.
I'm happy to share from here.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe as Nick shares our presentation, I would like to start maybe by talking a little bit about the major objectives. Of course, the most important purpose of the study was to understand young people's experiences of violence, but more specifically, we wanted to examine the prevalence of childhood maltreatment, both within and outside the home, across genders, boys versus girls, regions. In Uganda, we did a study in 2 regions, central Uganda, which is the more advanced, richer region, and then northern Uganda, which has which is more poverty-stricken. And then also they also help to emphasize the urban versus rural dimension. In other words, most of the schools we went to were either in urban areas or in rural areas. And then secondly, we wanted to assess the prevalence of exposure to violence within the home across genders, as I indicated, across genders as well, regions and districts. And then also to investigate the prevalence of underage marriage across genders, still among boys and girls, among central or northern region, and then urban or rural. And then lastly, we wanted to examine the mental health outcomes across genders as well, boys and girls, regionally, and then also in terms of settlement pattern. Yeah, so I think we can proceed now. Nick can move to the next objective. Maybe in terms of our overall experiences, we did not experience as much problem as our colleagues in UK or India or Jamaica in terms of accessing the schools. What happened is that we managed to obtain permission early on. We managed to bring on board the central government through the relevant Department of Education and Community Development, and also local governments, city council authorities. We brought them on board in terms of appreciating the purpose of the study and its potential contribution to Uganda. What I would like to note straight away is that Uganda is a very young country. Actually, 75% of the population is below the age of 30, of which children constitute over 50%. Children below 18 constitute over 50%. So government is usually very happy to work with actors who are interested in addressing issues that affect the well-being and the welfare of children. So we managed to interview 11,600 children across 76 schools in, I think, about, let me see the number of districts, Kampala, Wakiso, Masaka, Nakasongola, Lira, Dokolo, Gulu, Kitgum, about 9 districts in total that we went to. But of course, still, the process of obtaining clearance at the different levels, of course, was a little bit cumbersome. It took us a bit of time, but eventually when it was given, we were able to move rather smoothly and reach all the schools that we wanted to reach. Although in some cases, we did not talk to some pupils. I think in the candidate classes, but otherwise we managed to talk to most of the children that we wanted to talk to, 10 to 17. And of course, as you can see, Uganda was the country that scored the most in terms of number of children that were actually reached. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there were a few delays, especially within the capital city, but of course, still it was Ando. But maybe in terms of what emerged was that urban and private schools generally needed more time to decide whether to participate or not, compared to the schools within more rural communities. Maybe perhaps this is because of the complexity of ownership issues or board management issues, and then also maybe because of their experiences with other researchers who may have engaged with the school earlier on. Maybe one of the things that I may need to note here is that one funny example which we found in Lira, Lira is in northern Uganda. We were told that some people went there as if they were researchers going to work with the school to address problems affecting children. But then many of the children that they had contact with actually developed strange illness after some time, and some of them actually got extremely sick. So it was very hard to understand the intention of those people. So it was around the same time that we did the study as well, and that made the school, especially in that particular district of Lira, a bit more cautious, and they had to verify right from the district education office and in some cases also from the ministry whether we were who we claim we were in that kind of situation. In terms of the questions, the questions were fairly okay. The language was fairly complex for the questionnaire, but the children tried to understand it. Much as the language of instruction in Uganda is English, but then some words were a little bit complex for the children at that level, because most of the children that we interviewed were actually in upper primary school, but then of course the level of competence also varied based on regions. What I like to note at this point is that the level of educational performance in Uganda is in such a way that children in the central region tend to perform much better than those in the northern region. Northern region was affected by conflict for over 20 years, and we think it is one of those major effects of the war which still prevails within the region. Because when you go back to the pre-conflict days, the level of performance across the country was more or less the same across eastern, northern, central, and western Uganda. Yeah, so we had to take time to explain to the children what particular questions meant, instead of leaving them all the time to do the filling, to ensure that they understood what a particular question had asked. But this did not remove agency from them, or also any confidentiality that they actually wanted. Of course, we found many cases of abused children, and of course, some of them were further traumatized by the question. But I think, as Esther made earlier in our presentation, is that we had made arrangement with a national team of psychosocial actors to support them, and those numbers were made available to the children for those who wanted to make use of that services. But then also our research assistants were also trained in basic counseling and psychosocial support. Many of them were trained social workers, so they were able to engage and handle some of those cases at that particular level. Yeah, and of course, based on the difficult experiences of children, the experiences of abuse, of course, many of the children were made to relive what they had gone through in their homes, at school, and in their communities. And in that case, in that situation of our researchers and trying to support them, many of them, of course, got also exposed to secondary trauma through their exposure to the critical events in the life of these children. But then those are issues that we also had to handle and debrief some of those research assistants later on. And then, of course, the cost of travel to the field was very high, but they were managed within our budget. In terms of the results now, I would like to talk about it in particular sub-themes. The first one, we look at the experiences of maltreatment within the home. Corporal punishment, I think Catherine already talked about it as she introduced this particular work package, was very, very high in Uganda. What I want to note is that most Ugandan families and parents believe that the stick is the best way of disciplining a child. Even in schools, although institutionally the Ministry of Education has outlawed corporal punishment, and there is a policy instrument towards that, many schools in Uganda, and surprisingly, the majority are in central Uganda, where you would expect more enlightenment, still actually apply corporal punishment on children. And sometimes children are even beaten for very simple and trivial matters that they shouldn't be beaten over. So we actually see about 60.7% of children indicate that they have been subjected to corporal punishment. And then physical abuse, about 22.7%. But then there is also what we call, and then on non-contact sexual abuse, 18.7%. Now this is contrasted with a national study on violence against children, which was done in 2018, supported by the Ministry of Gender and UNICEF. And there it is, of course, indicated that up to 35.3% of female indicated to have been subjected to sexual abuse, and then 16.3 male. 35.3 female and then 16.3 male. But then what I want to note is that this particular study does not differentiate between, I mean the violence against children study does not differentiate between non-contact sexual abuse and contact sexual abuse. Emotional abuse, one of the things that actually stands out very, very high at 61.4%. Physical neglect, 15.2%. Medical neglect at 16.1%. And then emotional neglect, other than emotional abuse. Now this is emotional neglect, 46.5%. Still a very big issue as well. And then we can move on. So in terms of cross-tabulation of maltreatment at home, when we look at gender, girls are statistically significantly more likely to experience corporal punishment, emotional abuse, medical neglect, and emotional neglect compared to boys. But no significant differences among other forms of abuse by gender. And then in terms of region, children from central region were statistically significantly more likely to experience corporal punishment, emotional abuse, or emotional neglect than children from northern Uganda. This is also surprising in that, as I indicated earlier, central Uganda seemed to have the most of social services, intervention, is closer to the seat of power, is closer to the capital city. But as you can see that they are more likely to experience corporal punishment, which is actually more in consonance with what we know also through available anecdotal evidence that children in central Uganda are beaten more in schools compared to those in northern Uganda. In northern Uganda, parents at home may beat children, but when it comes to schools, teachers don't beat children. But then here, it appears to be maybe both ways. In contrast, children from northern Uganda were statistically significantly more likely to experience physical abuse and physical neglect. And then when we look at experience of maltreatment outside the home, for corporal punishment, this is at school, of course, 55.6% of all the children that we interviewed indicated that they've been subjected to corporal punishment from, outside the home. Of these 50, when we look at the violence against children study, 59.3% of females have been subjected to this, and then 68% of male. So more male have been subjected to this national, when you look at the national figure. And then in terms of physical abuse across the study district, it's 34.1%. And then non-contact sexual abuse is 39.3%. Contact sexual abuse is 15.5%. And then, of course, emotional abuse outside the home here is 65% across all the children. But then this is much higher compared to the national study done in 2018, which shows that 33.8% of female and 36% of male were respectively subjected to emotional abuse. So when we look at cross-tabulation of maltreatment outside the home, then girls were statistically significantly more likely than boys to experience contact sexual abuse and emotional abuse. In contrast, boys were statistically significantly more likely to experience corporal punishment and physical abuse. And there was no statistical significant gender difference in the experience of non-contact sexual abuse. And then also, when you look at it from a region point of view, still cross-tabulating maltreatment outside the home, children from the central region was statistically more likely to experience as already here, corporal punishment, non-contact sexual abuse, contact sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And there was no statistical significant difference in physical abuse between regions. And then when we look at experience of underage marriage, this one, of course, now from our study, underage marriage include all where children have been promised in marriage, formally engaged, the partner is engaged, promise in marriage, formally engaged, partner is identified for them, or they are married or they are living as if married. Now, when we talk about partner identification, I know it may be shocking to some of the people listening in. What happens is that in some communities, in many communities in Uganda, especially, I think, it can be found across both northern, central, and western. But there are particular communities or tribes that actually actively identify spouses for their children. And sometimes children are promised to be married to a child from another family from as young a age as 12 or even 9 when they reach puberty. That is how alarming it is. Now, when we look at this experience of underage marriage, only 13.7% of the people, 13.7% of those in our study indicated that they have had that experience of underage marriage. But then when we look at the violence against children study, 29.6% of girls and 6.7% of boys indicated to have been exposed to early marriage. The parameter there was early marriage. And then when we look at pressure, when they ask the children whether they feel in any way pressure to get married, 11.8% indicated that yes, they have been subjected to a lot of pressure to get married. Now, when we look at the cross-tabulation experience of underage marriage, boys were statistically significantly more likely than girls to have experienced child marriage, contrasted with the violence against children study indicated here, where there were more girls, 29.6, and 6.7% of boys. But our study, surprisingly, maybe Esther will talk a bit about it as well, when we go further to unpack the data, it shows that the boys' children, because our category were children 10 to 17, indicated to have had that experience of marriage, as we defined earlier, compared to girls, more boys, which we found a bit strange because it is not in consonant with the national study which was done in 2018. So it makes us wonder what could be the reason. Could it have been analysis? Could it have been something which, it is something which we may need to look into further, but that's what came out from the report. And we found a bit surprising. Yeah. But in terms of the pressure to get married, there was no much difference between boys and girls. And then regionally, compared to children from the central region, children from the northern region were statistically more likely to have experienced child marriage or perceived to marry. Yeah. Now, in terms of mental health outcomes, our study categorized mental health outcome in terms of anxiety and depression. And within that, we wanted to look at particular degrees of exposure, where we have either none to slight, mild, moderate, or severe. And for anxiety, up to 68.8% of young people in this study indicated some none to slight anxiety. 13.1 said it was mild, 15 indicated moderate, and then severe was reported in about 3% of cases. In the same way, up to 70.1% indicated none to slight depression, compared to 12.9 who indicated mild depression, 13.1 moderate, and then 4% severe depression. Now, when you compare this to national average, national average did not have this categorization as we have, so it is not a like for like categorization. It shows that 53.6% of children who are 13 to 17 years, which is within this range that we had, indicated or exhibited some degree of mental distress. So they indicated a percentage as high as 53.6. Well, when you look at our data here, the majority seem to say it is none to slight. But then for the national study, it is tend to show that it is high. I mean, they talk of mental distress. Although we've not had the parameters, the minute detailed parameters that they might have used, but that's what we have. Now, when you compare this to global average, a study which, global statistics from, I think, World Health Organization shows only about 6.2% of adolescents in the age group, I think 5 to 17, indicated depression, and then 3.2 indicated or was subjected to anxiety. And then it also shows that about 20% of adolescents experience a mental health disorder, or each year, of course, with self-harm, depression, anxiety, and other behavioral problems, the biggest issue. But then now, when you compare now this global statistics, 6.2, it shows that our study, it indicates that the cases are more in our population in Uganda. In terms of suicidal behavior, which is self-injury, suicide ideation, and suicide attempt, for non-suicidal self-injury, our study shows that up to 24.2% of children reported non-suicidal self-injury, contrasted with 11.4% on the violence against children study in Uganda, which still remains the most up-to-date study which covered all these parameters. And then under suicide ideation, our study shows 29.3. For this particular study, it was 22.3. Looking at the sample which we have, which was a very big sample, 11,600 children. I'm not even sure whether the national study had such a high sample, but of course, I have to note that our study was not as nationally representative as the violence against children study, which went to more districts. We went to fewer districts, which were more specific, and they tended to be skewed towards, as I indicated earlier, the central and the northern region. So maybe it is possible that these statistics may be the way they are. But it may also mean that between 2018 and 2019, when we did this study, there was an increment. And then under suicide attempt, in our study, 14.2% of children indicated to have had a suicide attempt. In the violence against children study, it is as high as 34.8%, which tells us that it is a phenomenal problem. When we cross-tabulate mental health outcomes, when you look at gender, compared to boys, interestingly, girls were statistically significantly more likely to report moderate to severe symptoms, both anxiety and depression. And then there was also a significantly higher rate of non-suicidal self-injury among boys than girls. In contrast, suicide ideation and suicide attempt were statistically significantly more common among girls than boys. Now, when we look at the everyday ordinary context within the community, many young people will tell you that, well, they try to discourage my sister from going out with a particular boy as a boyfriend, or they told her to stop going out with that particular person because she was still young. And then because of that, the person maybe ran away from home or tried to swallow tablets to do an overdose of pills to commit suicide. I mean, there are several anecdotal reports around such. So maybe this may explain, although it may not, it may partially explain that, probably based on perception of invasion of personal spaces by the young girls and not being allowed to make their own decision. And yet, as you could see, that these are young children who are below 18, not yet able to make independent and perhaps logical decision. So maybe parents come in to guide, and sometimes this guide is taken as invasion of private spaces, and then it can bring this kind of thing. In terms of mental health outcome by region, there was no statistically significant difference in symptoms of anxiety and depression between children from the North and Central region, but there was a significantly higher rate of non-suicidal self-injury among children from North compared to those from Central. And then also in contrast, suicide ideation was more common among children from the Central region than children from the Northern region. Now, we also find this surprising because many of the non-governmental organization reports and evaluation studies and some other academic studies that have been done in northern Uganda tend to show a higher rate of suicide or suicide ideation among young people above the age of 20, 24. And when we discussed it with Esther, Dr. Esther Nanfoka, the research fellow on our project, our view is that maybe the reason why there's a higher rate among young people 24 and above, the youth 24 and above, is because this is the group that grew up in the internally displaced persons camp. They grew up during the height of the war, or they were born in the internally displaced persons camps. So the way they look at life, the way they carry themselves is very different from the current younger generation who were born more recently, and then probably what they regard, as their values and whatever could all be different. I cannot see my screen. Nick, I don't know whether there's a bit of an issue in the projection. Nick, am I still online?
You are, Eric. We can still see your slides.
Surprisingly, they have disappeared from me. I can only see the small window down.
I'll click on the small window and it might make it bigger for you. I'm
trying to, because I'd click, what has happened? More action, exit full screen. Let me see whether when I exit full screen, it is any better. Enter full screen.
Is it Nick that's sharing the slides at the moment rather than you, Eric?
It is Nick who is sharing, yes.
Oh. Hi, Nick. Can you?
Hi there.
Eric can't see the slides, but we can.
Yeah, that's right. I'm still sharing from here, so I'm sure it's still working.
I'm only seeing it down. It was up on the main part of my screen, but I can see just something down, so I'm not able to read it. Just down on the lower part where we have the names of the participants as well.
And can you just click on that little square? Can you click on it and it makes it big?
That's what I'm trying, but I don't know whether it is my laptop which is not responding now. I can only see your whatever which is on the main screen. Your name, Nadia.
Right.
So,
Eric,
yes.
Alternatively, I think there's only one slide to go on recommendations, so you could read as Nick projects.
Okay, let me now go to my slide. It's fine.
Thank you.
So okay, yeah. So So I don't know whether we finished this. I said there was significant higher rate of non-suicidal. There was In contrast, suicide ideation was more common among children from Central region. Yes, I indicated that. And there was no statistical significant difference in suicide attempts between the regions. And then now when we go to the last slide on recommendations, in terms of policy and intervention, our view is that this should address the multiple forms of violence and neglect at home. It is important that interventions and policies should identify, explicate, and clearly be aimed at addressing the multiple forms of violence. But then as to whether we are still focusing on that is another thing altogether, because Uganda several years ago had what they call the National Strategic Program Plan of Intervention for Orphans and Vulnerable Children. We implemented over a 5-year period, and then eventually it was phased out. Maybe Esther will talk about it, I think in favor of other more broader interventions, but sometimes maybe the broader intervention have not been able to pick out the specific important issues which may address the real situation or the unique, what Adele called yesterday, the particularity of the universal in terms of the experiences of those that are facing this kind of violence. And then also strengthening legislative enforcement, including increased awareness about existing child protection laws. There may be a need to train teachers in prevention, protection, and response to violence. And then there's also need to recognize and respond to the negative mental health outcomes of violence against children. And then the last one is behavior change intervention, including strategies to change religious and cultural norms, customs, and values that promote tolerance for violence against children. Before I end, I want to ask Esther if she has anything she wants to add, maybe to comment on any of the other surprising things. Thank you very much, Esther.
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. But in the interest of time, I think I'll let Nadia proceed. I think you've been quite elaborate.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you, Eric. I mean, it just really shows the complexity of doing this work, and actually the findings have been phenomenal.